Hurry up with the inheritance, Vanessa whispered behind the last row of folding chairs, her voice low but sharp enough to cut through the scent of lilies and polished wood, and Margaret Whitmore heard every word as she stood beside her husband's casket. The chapel in Westport was nearly empty now, the early afternoon light filtering through stained glass and casting muted colors across the carpet, and Margaret remained still in her black wool coat, her gloved hands folded neatly at her waist, as if nothing had reached her ears at all. Edward Whitmore had been her husband for 48 years, a man who measured life in steady routines. 6:30 a.m. coffee, Saturday lawn care, handwritten anniversary cards every June. And now he lay surrounded by white roses that Vanessa had insisted were more elegant than carnations. Margaret's gaze rested on Edward's photograph near the guest book, the one taken on their 40th anniversary in front of the house they had bought in 1983, a 3,200-square-foot colonial with blue shutters and a wraparound porch he painted himself every other summer. She could hear the soft murmur of distant relatives discussing travel plans, hear the rustle of coats being slipped on, hear her son Daniel thanking guests for coming, his voice tight and tired, and beneath it all, she could still hear that sentence replaying in her mind. Hurry up with the inheritance, not whispered in grief but in impatience, as though Edward's life had been a meeting that ran overtime. Margaret did not turn around. She did not clear her throat or let her expression shift. She simply adjusted the small gold brooch pinned to her lapel, the one Edward had given her on their 25th anniversary, and continued greeting the final guests with the same composed nod she had practiced all morning. Vanessa's heels clicked lightly across the hardwood floor as she approached Daniel, and Margaret noticed the way her daughter-in-law's hand rested on his arm, guiding him toward a quiet corner near the exit where estate papers would soon be discussed in practical tones. The word inheritance lingered in the air heavier than the incense, and Margaret felt something settle inside her, not anger exactly, not even surprise, but a clarity that arrived as steady as the tide rolling against the Connecticut shore. For weeks before the heart attack, Edward had spoken in measured sentences about putting everything in order, about making sure Margaret would never have to ask permission to remain in her own home, about ensuring that respect would matter more than money. And she remembered how he had squeezed her hand across the kitchen table, sunlight falling over the oak surface they had refinished together years ago. Now, as the funeral director quietly closed the chapel doors and the last bouquet was carried out, Margaret allowed herself one slow breath. Daniel approached her with eyes rimmed red, asking if she was ready to go home, and she offered him a small, steady smile that revealed nothing of what she had overheard. Outside, the November air was crisp, just under 50 degrees, and the sky stretched pale and indifferent above the parking lot. Margaret paused at the top of the chapel steps, looking straight ahead rather than back, knowing that grief could hollow a person out, but knowing also that impatience could reveal far more than sorrow ever would. And as Vanessa's car door slammed shut a little too quickly, Margaret understood that Edward's funeral had not only marked the end of a life, but the beginning of something else entirely, something quiet, deliberate, and far from finished. The house felt larger that evening, as though the walls had quietly stepped back to create more distance between the rooms, and Margaret Whitmore noticed the silence first when she unlocked the front door and stepped into the foyer with its polished hardwood floors and the faint scent of lemon oil that Edward used every Sunday afternoon. Daniel carried in a casserole dish someone had sent from church, placing it carefully on the granite kitchen counter, while Vanessa walked through the living room with the critical eye of someone assessing square footage rather than memories. Margaret removed her black coat and hung it on the brass hook by the staircase, the same hook Edward had installed in 1991 after she complained about clutter near the entryway, and she let her fingertips linger for a second longer than necessary before smoothing the fabric flat. The clock above the fireplace read 4:30 in the afternoon, yet the winter light outside already looked thin and tired, casting long shadows across the beige sofa they had chosen together when Daniel was in college. Daniel cleared his throat and asked if she wanted tea, and she nodded once, grateful for the ordinary sound of water filling the kettle, because ordinary sounds did not ask about inheritance or paperwork. Vanessa moved slowly around the dining room table, running her hand across the mahogany surface as if measuring it, then glancing toward the staircase that led to the master bedroom, where Edward's suits still hung in precise rows, spaced exactly 2 fingers apart. Margaret noticed everything without appearing to notice anything at all. She sat in her usual chair by the window, the one that overlooked the backyard where Edward had planted 2 maple trees 20 years ago, and she watched as the wind stirred the last of the autumn leaves across the lawn. Daniel set a mug in front of her, his movements gentle but distracted, and she saw how his eyes flickered briefly toward Vanessa, who stood near the kitchen island scrolling through her phone with an expression that was already calculating next steps. No one mentioned the whispered sentence from the chapel. No one mentioned estate documents or timelines. Yet the air carried an unspoken urgency that did not belong to grief. Margaret lifted the tea to her lips and allowed the warmth to steady her breathing. She remembered Edward at this very table 3 weeks ago, discussing maintenance on the roof, reminding her where the warranty papers were kept, speaking in calm, practical sentences that now echoed with new meaning. The house had always been more than walls and square footage. It held 48 years of shared mornings, of birthday dinners, of quiet evenings spent reading side by side. Vanessa's heels clicked once more across the tile as she approached the hallway leading to the study, and Margaret noticed how Daniel hesitated before following her, as though unsure whether to remain by his mother's side or align himself with his wife's quiet agenda. Margaret did not stop them. She did not ask what they were looking for. She simply set her cup down with deliberate care and folded her hands in her lap, aware that grief could make a person appear fragile, but also aware that patience, when held long enough, could reveal exactly who was already planning life beyond the mourning period. The following morning arrived with a pale gray sky and a quiet that felt almost rehearsed, and Margaret Whitmore woke before sunrise out of habit rather than rest, lying still on her side of the king-sized bed, while Edward's side remained perfectly smooth and undisturbed. She listened to the hum of the furnace turning on, to the distant sound of a delivery truck passing on Maple Ridge Road, and to the faint creak of floorboards downstairs where Vanessa was already moving about the kitchen far earlier than she ever had before. Margaret rose slowly, tying the sash of her robe with steady hands, and paused at the doorway of the bedroom to glance at Edward's dresser, where his wristwatch still rested beside a folded handkerchief. Nothing had been touched. Not yet. When she reached the bottom of the staircase, she found Vanessa seated at the kitchen island with a legal pad open in front of her, a pen tapping lightly against the paper, as if keeping time with some internal schedule. Daniel stood by the sink, staring out at the backyard, shoulders slightly hunched, his reflection faint in the glass. Margaret poured herself a cup of coffee, measuring 2 careful scoops of grounds just as she had for decades, and greeted them both in a calm, even tone. Vanessa returned the greeting with a polite smile that did not quite reach her eyes, then asked in a voice that sounded almost casual whether Margaret knew where Edward had kept the updated estate folder. The question floated in the air like a harmless inquiry, yet it carried weight, the kind that pressed gently but persistently. Margaret stirred her coffee once, watching the cream swirl into soft patterns before answering that Edward had always been organized, and that everything important was exactly where it belonged. Daniel shifted slightly at that, as though the words contained more meaning than the surface suggested. Vanessa nodded and began listing items on the legal pad: property valuation, investment accounts, retirement funds, the insurance policy on the house. She spoke in measured phrases, framing each point as practical, necessary, responsible. Margaret observed without interruption, noting how quickly grief had given way to logistics. After a moment, Vanessa suggested that the house might be too much for one person to manage, mentioning the cost of heating 3,000 square feet through a Connecticut winter and the upkeep of the yard once spring arrived. Daniel added softly that perhaps downsizing could reduce stress. Margaret carried her coffee to the dining room and ran her fingertips along the back of one of the chairs Edward had refinished by hand, remembering how he had insisted on keeping solid wood rather than replacing it with something modern and convenient. She returned to the kitchen and thanked them both for their concern, her voice level and unhurried, then remarked that decisions of that size required time and clarity. Vanessa's pen paused mid-tap. Daniel looked from his mother to his wife, uncertainty flickering across his face. Margaret set her cup down with quiet precision and met her son's eyes for a full second longer than usual, not pleading, not accusing, simply present. In that silence, she began to see the outlines of a plan forming beyond their notepad and whispered timelines, and she understood that patience would not only protect her dignity, it would reveal exactly how far their urgency was willing to go. That afternoon, Margaret Whitmore climbed the staircase slowly, her hand resting lightly on the polished banister Edward had sanded and stained himself years ago, and she entered the master bedroom with the steady composure of someone walking into a memory rather than a room. Sunlight filtered through the sheer curtains, illuminating the quilt folded neatly at the foot of the bed, the framed photograph of their first house in Stamford, and the faint outline on the carpet where Edward's armchair had always stood. She moved toward his dresser and opened the top drawer, lifting the stack of folded shirts he had not yet taken to the cleaners. Inhaling the faint scent of cedar from the blocks he insisted on placing between layers. Beneath the shirts lay a slim leather folder, worn at the edges, and Margaret traced the seam with her fingertips before lifting it out. She remembered a quiet evening in October when Edward had sat across from her at the kitchen table, a single lamp casting warm light over a spread of documents. His reading glasses balanced low on his nose as he explained that clarity was a form of protection. He had spoken not with urgency, but with certainty, reminding her that every account, every deed, every investment had been organized carefully, not only for efficiency, but for fairness. Margaret carried the folder to the bed and sat down, opening it to reveal neatly labeled sections, each page clipped and dated in Edward's precise handwriting. Property deed, retirement accounts, insurance policies, a letter addressed to her in his unmistakable script. She did not open the letter yet. Instead, she listened to the muted sounds downstairs, Vanessa's voice rising and falling in practical tones, Daniel responding with short answers that lacked conviction. The house held more than square footage and valuation numbers. It held decisions made side by side over nearly 5 decades, long before spreadsheets and legal pads entered the picture. Margaret thought of the morning Edward had insisted on installing storm windows himself during a January cold snap, declaring that the house deserved care from the people who loved it most. She thought of the countless evenings they had balanced the checkbook together, agreeing that money was a tool, never the purpose. The leather folder felt solid in her lap, heavier than its thin pages suggested. For the first time since the chapel, she allowed herself to unfold the letter. Edward's words were steady, deliberate, filled with the same calm tone he used when fixing a leaky faucet or explaining interest rates to Daniel years ago. He wrote about trust, about respect, about ensuring that no one would pressure her into decisions made from haste or fear. Margaret read each line slowly, her expression unchanged, but something inside her shifted into place with quiet resolve. Downstairs, a drawer slid open and shut. Footsteps crossed the kitchen tile. Margaret closed the folder and returned it to the drawer exactly where she had found it, smoothing the shirts back into place. When she stood and looked around the bedroom, she no longer saw absence alone. She saw structure. She saw intention. And as she descended the staircase once more, her posture straight and composed, she understood that Edward had not only prepared for his departure, he had prepared for what might follow, and she intended to honor that preparation with patience rather than reaction. The next morning arrived with a steady drizzle that tapped softly against the kitchen windows, and Margaret Whitmore stood at the counter slicing a single piece of toast, while the house carried the faint scent of rain and brewed coffee. Daniel had left early for work, his goodbye brief and distracted, and Vanessa remained at the dining table with her laptop open, the glow of the screen reflecting in her eyes as she scrolled through real estate listings in the same zip code. Margaret did not comment on the images of staged living rooms and newly renovated kitchens that flickered across the display. Instead, she moved with quiet purpose, rinsing her plate and placing it carefully in the drying rack before reaching for the landline phone mounted beside the pantry door. The number had been memorized for decades, and she dialed without hesitation, listening to the steady ring that connected her to Harold Green, the family attorney who had handled Edward's business matters for nearly 30 years. When his familiar voice answered, warm but professional, Margaret requested a meeting at his office at the earliest convenience, explaining in calm tones that she wished to review the estate documents personally. Harold paused only briefly before agreeing to see her that afternoon. Margaret thanked him and returned the receiver to its cradle with measured precision. Vanessa looked up from her laptop, eyebrows lifting slightly as she asked who Margaret had called. Margaret met her gaze evenly and replied that it was simply a routine matter. That clarity brought peace of mind. Vanessa nodded, though her fingers resumed typing with greater speed, and the faint clicking of keys filled the space between them. By 2 o'clock, the rain had tapered into a mist, and Margaret drove her silver sedan down the familiar road toward downtown Westport, passing the bakery where she and Edward used to stop for cinnamon rolls on Saturdays, and the hardware store where he purchased nails in bulk every spring. Harold Green's office occupied the second floor of a brick building overlooking the harbor, the brass nameplate polished to a quiet shine. Inside, the waiting room smelled faintly of paper and old wood, and Margaret sat upright in a high-backed chair, her handbag resting neatly in her lap. When Harold greeted her, his expression carried genuine sympathy, but also an understanding that this visit held more than condolences. In his office, surrounded by framed certificates and shelves lined with leather-bound volumes, Margaret listened as he outlined the structure of the estate, each asset documented, each account secured. He spoke of safeguards Edward had insisted upon, provisions designed to prevent haste or coercion. Margaret absorbed every detail without interruption, her posture steady, her questions precise. Outside the window, the harbor water moved slowly beneath a pale sky, indifferent yet constant. As Harold concluded, he slid a sealed envelope across the desk, explaining that Edward had requested it remain unopened until Margaret chose to review it herself. She accepted it with both hands, feeling the weight of intention within its thin paper. When she stepped back onto the sidewalk, the air felt clearer than it had that morning. She did not hurry to the car. She did not call Daniel. She simply stood for a moment, aware that the urgency she sensed at home would soon meet the structure Edward had carefully put in place. And for the first time since the chapel, Margaret allowed herself a small, knowing breath that carried neither fear nor resentment, only resolve. Margaret Whitmore did not open the sealed envelope the moment she returned home. Instead, she placed it carefully inside the top drawer of her writing desk in the study, aligning it neatly beside a stack of thank you cards she had yet to send, and she removed her gloves with the same deliberate calm she had maintained all week. The late afternoon light slanted through the tall windows, illuminating dust motes that drifted slowly in the air, and for a moment, she simply stood there listening to the distant hum of traffic from the main road. When Daniel arrived shortly after 5:30, the front door closed with a heavier sound than usual, and she could hear Vanessa speaking in low, urgent tones before he even set his briefcase down. Their conversation carried into the hallway, fragments of phrases about timelines and responsibilities, and making practical decisions sooner rather than later. Margaret remained seated at the desk, pen in hand, finishing a note addressed to an old neighbor who had attended the service. She folded the card, slid it into its envelope, and only then stepped into the kitchen where Daniel and Vanessa stood side by side at the island. Vanessa had a printed document spread across the granite surface, several sections highlighted in bright yellow, and she explained that it was simply a preliminary assessment of the property value, something to help everyone think realistically about the future. Daniel avoided his mother's eyes, nodding as though rehearsing agreement. Margaret moved to the refrigerator and retrieved a glass pitcher of water, pouring 3 glasses without haste before taking her place at the table. She listened as Vanessa outlined the advantages of selling while the market remained strong, mentioning comparable homes in the neighborhood that had recently sold for substantial sums, emphasizing how large houses could become burdensome for one person to maintain. Margaret folded her hands atop the table and thanked Vanessa for her research, her voice even, her expression unreadable. She then stated quietly that she had met with Harold Green that afternoon to review the estate documents personally, and that there were provisions Edward had insisted upon which required careful consideration before any decisions were made. The room grew noticeably still. Daniel looked up quickly, surprise crossing his features, while Vanessa's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Margaret continued in the same calm tone, explaining that Edward had structured the estate in a manner designed to prevent rushed choices and external pressure, and that a formal reading of the documents would take place at the attorney's office the following week. Vanessa opened her mouth as if to respond, then closed it again, her highlighted pages suddenly less authoritative against the granite. Daniel asked quietly if everything was in order, and Margaret met his gaze steadily, assuring him that everything was precisely as Edward intended. She lifted her glass of water and took a measured sip, allowing the silence to stretch without discomfort. Outside, the maple trees shifted gently in the evening breeze, their branches steady despite the earlier rain, and within the quiet kitchen Margaret sensed the first subtle shift in balance, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable, as urgency encountered preparation and impatience met structure. The following Tuesday arrived cold and clear, the sky stretched wide and pale above the harbor as Margaret Whitmore stepped out of her silver sedan and adjusted the collar of her navy wool coat before walking toward Harold Green's office. Daniel and Vanessa had driven separately, arriving just minutes earlier, and Margaret noticed the way Vanessa stood near the entrance reviewing something on her phone while Daniel shifted his weight from one foot to the other. Inside, the waiting room felt quieter than usual, the ticking of a wall clock echoing faintly against the paneled walls. Harold greeted them with professional courtesy and led them into the conference room, where a long polished table reflected the morning light and 3 leather chairs had been placed side by side across from his own. Margaret chose the center seat without hesitation, setting her handbag neatly at her feet and folding her hands on the table as though attending a routine appointment rather than a turning point. Harold began with a measured summary of Edward's estate, outlining the property, the retirement accounts, the investment portfolio, each asset described with calm precision. Vanessa listened intently, her posture upright, a slim notebook resting open in front of her, while Daniel kept his eyes fixed on the wood grain of the table. When Harold reached the section detailing the primary residence, he paused briefly before continuing, explaining that Edward had structured ownership so that Margaret retained full and exclusive control over the home for the duration of her lifetime, with no authority granted to any other party to sell, transfer, or leverage the property without her explicit written consent. Vanessa's pen stopped moving. The room remained still except for the faint hum of the heating system. Harold then opened a separate folder and referenced an additional clause Edward had added several months prior, one that required any beneficiary to demonstrate good faith and respect toward Margaret in all financial matters, noting that attempts to pressure or expedite decisions regarding inheritance could result in forfeiture of certain discretionary distributions. The words were delivered evenly, without emphasis, yet they carried unmistakable weight. Daniel looked up sharply, confusion and realization crossing his features at the same time, while Vanessa's expression remained composed but noticeably rigid. Margaret did not glance at either of them. She kept her gaze forward, absorbing each sentence as confirmation rather than surprise. Harold concluded by stating that Edward's intent had been clear: stability first, fairness always, and protection above convenience. Silence followed, not awkward but undeniable. Daniel finally spoke, asking quietly if there was any timeline attached to the distribution of assets, and Harold replied that timelines were flexible and dependent upon Margaret's comfort and judgment. Margaret lifted her chin slightly and thanked Harold for his thorough explanation, her voice steady, her tone measured. As they rose from the table, Vanessa gathered her notebook more slowly than before, the earlier urgency replaced by careful restraint. Outside, the wind moved briskly across the sidewalk, carrying the faint scent of salt from the harbor, and Margaret felt the balance shift fully into place, not through confrontation or raised voices, but through preparation quietly revealed at the exact moment it was needed. The drive home from the attorney's office unfolded in near silence, the winter sun sitting low over the Long Island Sound, as Margaret Whitmore kept her eyes steady on the road and her hands relaxed at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel. Daniel followed behind in his own car, and Vanessa remained in the passenger seat beside him, her posture upright, her gaze fixed straight ahead as though calculating outcomes rather than scenery. When they pulled into the driveway of the blue-shuttered Colonial, the house appeared unchanged, solid and patient against the pale sky, its porch lights still set on the automatic timer Edward had installed years earlier. Margaret stepped out first, the gravel crunching softly beneath her shoes, and paused for a brief second before unlocking the front door. Inside, the warmth of the heating system greeted them, along with the familiar scent of polished wood and faint cinnamon from the candle Margaret had lit that morning. Daniel entered quietly, setting his keys in the ceramic bowl near the entryway, while Vanessa walked into the living room and stood beside the fireplace, her arms folded loosely across her chest. The air between them felt different now, not tense but recalibrated. Daniel cleared his throat and began speaking in a tone that suggested both apology and confusion, explaining that he had not understood the full structure of the estate and that he had assumed certain decisions would unfold more quickly. Margaret listened without interruption, her expression neither stern nor indulgent. She moved toward the window overlooking the backyard where the two maple trees stood bare and steady, their branches tracing delicate lines against the sky. Vanessa finally spoke, her voice measured and controlled, acknowledging that perhaps discussions about timing had been premature, that everyone was simply trying to plan responsibly. Margaret turned slowly, meeting her daughter-in-law's gaze with calm composure. She stated gently that planning was wise, but pressure was unnecessary, and that Edward had always believed respect was the foundation upon which every other decision should rest. The room fell quiet once more. Daniel stepped closer to his mother, his shoulders less rigid than before, and asked if there was anything she needed in the coming weeks. Margaret shook her head lightly and replied that what she needed most was time, not to decide quickly, not to distribute assets, but to sit in the life she and Edward had built without feeling hurried through it. Vanessa lowered her arms and glanced toward the hallway leading to the study. As though reassessing the space she had previously measured in square footage and potential resale value. Outside, a thin wind brushed against the windows, but the house did not shift. Margaret moved toward the kitchen and began preparing dinner with the same steady rhythm she had practiced for decades, the sound of a knife against the cutting board deliberate and unhurried. Daniel offered to help, and she handed him a towel to dry the dishes, a simple task that carried no agenda. In the quiet repetition of ordinary motions, Margaret felt the final balance settle fully into place, not through confrontation, not through raised voices, but through clarity revealed at exactly the right moment, leaving urgency without footing and leaving her, at last, firmly rooted where she belonged. Winter settled in gradually over the next several weeks, layering the Whitmore home in quiet routines rather than dramatic change, and Margaret Whitmore found comfort in the steadiness of mornings that began with coffee brewed at 6:30 and the soft glow of the kitchen light reflecting off the granite counters. Daniel returned to his office schedule with renewed focus, his visits to the house becoming less about documents and more about checking on his mother, while Vanessa's presence shifted from assertive to carefully measured, her earlier urgency replaced by polite distance. Margaret noticed these adjustments without comment. She continued tending to the maple trees in the backyard, wrapping their lower trunks with protective mesh before the first frost, and she scheduled the annual furnace inspection just as Edward had done every December, ensuring that the house remained prepared for the colder months ahead. One afternoon, as snow began to fall in thin, deliberate flakes, Daniel arrived alone and stood beside her at the living room window, watching the yard turn white. He spoke quietly, admitting that he had allowed assumptions to guide him, that he had mistaken efficiency for responsibility, and that he now understood the difference between planning and pressuring. Margaret listened, her gaze fixed on the snowfall, and then she placed a gentle hand over his for a brief moment, not as forgiveness declared, but as understanding offered. Vanessa's visits became less frequent after that, and when she did step through the front door, she did so with a softened tone, asking if Margaret needed groceries or help with errands rather than inquiring about valuations or timelines. The house itself seemed to exhale, the tension that had once lingered in hallways and at the kitchen island dissolving into ordinary sounds again, the clink of dishes, the quiet hum of the dishwasher, the distant ticking of the clock above the fireplace. One evening, Margaret retrieved the sealed letter Edward had left and read it once more by the light of the table lamp, absorbing his steady handwriting and the confidence woven into each sentence. He had trusted her judgment, trusted her patience, trusted her strength long before circumstances demanded proof of it. She folded the letter carefully and returned it to the drawer, not as a secret weapon, but as a reminder of partnership that extended beyond presence. Outside, the porch light cast a warm circle onto the snow-covered steps, illuminating the path without spectacle. Margaret stood at the front window and looked out at the quiet street, aware that the inheritance Edward had spoken of in legal terms was only part of what he had left behind. He had left preparation. He had left structure. He had left the assurance that dignity would not be surrendered to impatience. As the evening deepened and the house settled into stillness, Margaret turned off the living room lamp and made her way upstairs with unhurried steps, understanding that her greatest response had not been confrontation, but composure, and that in the calm space she preserved, respect had quietly reclaimed its rightful place.